and to introduce my guest, Morgan Twain-Peterson, Master of Wine. You're the first MW on our show. And
Cool.
yeah, and I'm a little intimidated, to be perfectly honest.
Hopefully not the last.
No,
No.
but this is going to be a fantastic session. I'm so excited about it. Thanks for your time, Morgan. We're going to talk about Sonoma Valley.
No.
Yeah, that's okay. You got to close something. I did
Yeah,
that.
yeah, sorry.
I'm done.
It was the YouTube feed in the back that I had been giving to my sister. So that is now closed. So cool.
So, couple of things. Just the whole goal of these sessions is to have them be super interactive. So I'd like to ask you to all of our viewers out there to start giving us your questions soon as you can, because what's ended up happening in the past is we get all the questions at the end and then we can't answer them. So we want to make this interactive. So if you've got a question, there's no time like the present. Morgan suggests drinking some Bedrock wine immediately.
Yes.
So to get people,
let's get those questions going. Let's get
going. And yeah, obviously we're going through a pretty complex time in our lives. So Morgan, I hope you and your family are safe and your team is safe, because there's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, no, we're all doing really, really well. The good news about vineyard work, which is mainly what's going on right now, is that in and of itself is sort of by definition socially distanced, and our cellar crew is literally going in, switching off days, doing stuff like that, and most importantly, my parents are doing very well and healthy, and we're doing as much shopping and looking out for them as we can. So I think that's kind of what all of us are doing right now. So
yeah,
but yeah, we're just hanging in like everybody else.
Yeah. I guess the life in the vineyard goes on no matter what, right? So
things are growing. It was 76 degrees here yesterday, and I think I could literally see shoot tips growing in front of my eyes. So vines are ready to go and they're full of vigor. So whether we like it or not, it's here.
Wow, cool. So today we're going to talk about Sonoma Valley, which is a part of obviously the broader Sonoma County. And I just, in the time I've spent visiting these vineyards and tasting wines and meeting growers and people who make the wines, I've just been absolutely blown away by the diversity and the history of these vineyards, which are to me still hidden jewels, because so much of California wine, quote unquote, seems to be sort of like Napa Valley centric, and the vintages are always sort of what happened in Napa is kind of that's the vintage everywhere. And right. We love Napa Valley, of course, but when you go over the mountain and you end up in Moon Mountain and then you come down to Sonoma Valley, for me, it was just like this opening of just all sorts of new things, but they're actually not that new. It's quite the opposite.
Yeah.
And there are some vineyards that are obviously very old. And what we're going to do today is talk about Sonoma Valley, the cruise of Sonoma Valley. So single vineyards. They have a commonality. These are all vineyards planted in the 1880s.
Yep.
More or less. Correct me if I'm wrong, but more or less.
Yep. No, you got it.
About 2 miles apart, you reminded me of before we went live or talked this afternoon. So they're very close to each other. And so I guess my first question, Morgan, is there a commonality that links these vineyards, or are they really different? And just so that everybody knows, we're talking about 4 vineyards. We'll show you the maps in a second. Monte Rosso, Bedrock, Old Hill, and Pagani. So is there something that links them?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple factors of commonality. 3 of the vineyards, Monte Rosso, Bedrock, and Old Hill, are all on soils derived from Mount Veeder or the Moon Mountain district. So you see that very common Tuscan red clay loam tossed with a lot of basalt. Pagani Ranch the soils are derived from the mountain on the other side of the valley, Sonoma Mountain, which seems to have a little bit more tufa, a little bit more volcanics. And it's also the farthest sort of northwest of the 4 vineyards. But what I would say in general, I think, particularly when I taste through our wines, because we have the great opportunity to make wines from Russian River Valley and Dry Creek and other old vines elsewhere, is the Sonoma Valley wines to me always have this both a lot of like spice element to it, a lot of perfume, and frankly, they also have a fair amount of structure for sort of a lack of a better way of putting it. Sometimes if like Russian River Valley features this really like opulent blue fruited character, Sonoma Valley is a little bit more like terse, it's a tense, it's a little bit more red fruited. And frankly, I think sometimes the wines take a little longer to unwind. Maybe they're not as immediately pliant, but I think that they also offer some really wonderful long-term rewards, which you can see sort of in the older Old Hill wines that my dad made, and older Monterosso wines that other people have made as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that your dad always does when we taste in January is he always pulls out a few of these older Ravenswood wines, and they're just magical, and it's true. It's a testament to the way that these vineyards can age. And so you mentioned something important that I think is important to sort of orient people to the area that we're talking about, because you mentioned Mount Veeder. So Mount Veeder is the Napa Valley side,
right,
mountain range. And then as you cross over at a certain point, you enter Sonoma County, and then that appellation is Moon Mountain. And as you go down Moon Mountain and you enter the valley, now you're in this area that we're talking about. Monterosso is technically a Moon Mountain vineyard, but the others, so Sonoma, then you enter Sonoma Valley, which is itself an AVA that includes Bennett Valley, Sonoma Mountain, Moon Mountain.
Yes.
What we are going to call in our maps really the core of Sonoma Valley, which is the actual valley part, and then the Sonoma part of Carneros to the south.
Right, and even part of Bennett Valley.
Yeah, well, hopefully I mentioned it.
So it's ill-defined, to say the least.
It's a complex mosaic, and then within that, there's this little tenderloin of vineyards, which is where most of these are, with the exception of Monterosso, which is just slightly uphill.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And, until the Moon Mountain AVA was created, and, it's interesting because I think there's certain AVAs that I've seen that have been created that don't make a ton of sense. Moon Mountain makes an enormous amount of sense. And I think that it was long overdue in its creation, because you really do see something very unique and individual up there. But for the longest time, Monterosso, at least when I was growing up, was always considered Sonoma Valley. And it's only in the last, half decade or so since Moon Mountain's really been in place that we can now sort of rethink about it as Moon Mountain, which is really what it should be. But there is something nice in, I always like tasting Monterosso and Bedrock side by side, because Monterosso is up on the mountain, but Bedrock is literally right underneath it. So it's in the alluvial wash that is literally washed off the mountainside from the creek that goes through, like right to the north of Monterosso, and has scattered that soil all over an alluvial wash onto the Sonoma Valley floor. So it's very fun to taste Monterosso, which is this very classic mountain fruit expression of Zinfandel, next to Bedrock, which is the same soils, but it's valley floor. And, there's a few other differences when it comes to variety that we can get into, but, Monterosso has long been one of the most famous vineyards in California. It's known for making these extraordinarily long-lived wines. If you get good bottles of like martini mountain wines from the late 60s and early 70s, they can be unbelievable. I mean, I've had like early 70s martini mountain Barberas that are just really pretty incredible. And so, the wines really sort of age on the backbone of the sort of natural brightness and also the tannin that comes with being in a mountain site. And what's really interesting about Monterosso is, even though it was planted in the late 1880s, or these vines were, unlike Pagani, Old Hill, and Bedrock, which are these, this field blend of, 17 to upwards of 40 different varieties, Monterosso, almost all the blocks are nearly uniform Zinfandel. There's small amounts of Alicante Boucher and Grand Noir, which are coloring varieties. We call them teinturiers or tincture varieties. But our block is like 98% Zinfandel, yet they still make one of the most long-lived wines. And, that's sort of maybe a bit at odds with what I've seen in other older sites that are just pure Zinfandel, where sometimes those wines have a lot of upfront joyousness to them, but they don't necessarily make long bones and old bones. And Monterosso, just sort of has this ability to age that almost is sort of beyond any empirical reasoning that I can give it, other than the fact that it just does it. So in some ways, it's almost like, I don't know, sometimes you have some of those really old wines from Piedmont, and you look at the color and you look at everything and you're like, how did this wine actually age that long? In fact, behind me on the wall, there's a bottle of 1964 Berlotto Palaverga that I had that was still somehow alive. And you have a fresh bottle of Palo Verga, you're like, how in the world could this wine ever last 40 years? But somehow it does. And, you know, and Monte Rosso, I think, is kind of the same way in many ways.
Yeah, and so here we have a map. This is one of the maps that we've done. We have, you know, as you know, Morgan, we have this big mapping project for all of Sonoma Valley, and then we've got these isolated ones that we've done. And so on the left, you can see Monte Rosso in its context. And so one of the things that you can easily see on this map is that it's kind of an elevated plateau. I mean, yeah, there's hills, there's definitely hillsides, but the shape of the land, you can see it's just sort of risen. You can see right there how elevated it is. You can see it here we're at 960 feet. Moon Mountain itself is 17-ish and change. So it's not super high like the top. And you're sort of there in the middle in this plateau. And then down here, this is where we're going to go now afterwards. This is, you know, all the true valley floor vineyards. So here you're up on this plateau. Your blocks of Zin are here, I think. And you are one of the very few people who gets this fruit.
Yeah, we've been really fortunate to have a long-standing relationship with Monte Rosso and with Gallo, who owns it. You know, what I love so much about the fact that we get to make this fruit is, you know, I started working with Monte Rosso in 2008. And at that point, I was just working with the old line Semillon that is up there. It's some of the oldest Semillon in the world that we know of. It's absolutely amazing. And I kept begging for Zinfandel because my dad worked with Monte Rosso Zinfandel from 1993 to 2001. And he was actually the very first person that Mike Martini sold fruit through from Martini Winery prior to the Martini acquisition by Gallo. And so I'd been begging for multiple years for Zinfandel fruit. And at one point they're like, we've got a block for you. And, you know, Monte Rosso is not a small vineyard. You can see all the blocks that are there. You can see all the Zinfandel. And somehow by some small miracle, they brought me back to the exact same block that my dad worked with from 93 to 2001. So it's really exciting because, as you said, my dad will always, his favorite party trick is to bust out old Ravenswood wines. And what's great is we can now do these tastings where we have these, you know, old Ravenswood wines that are, you know, really showing beautifully. The 93 itself is one of the best wines I think my dad ever made. And we can now try those against our wines from the exact same block, you know, however many decades later. And that's a really exciting thing to have sort of that level of continuity. And it's been really wonderful that Gallo has sort of seen that and seen how special it is. And they've done an incredible job taking care of the vineyard as well. I think sometimes, you know, people get a little suspicious of larger companies, but I mean, Gallo has really poured resources and love into the vineyard, and their vineyard manager, Bernet Royal, is one of the best vineyard managers that I've ever had the opportunity to work with. So, you know, it's in really good hands. Every time I go up to Monte Rosso though, I'm amazed because you've got to think about, you know, Emmanuel Goldstein, the guy who originally decided to plant this vineyard in the 1880s. And he's driving through Sonoma Valley. He's surrounded by all these beautiful, fertile fields that have nothing growing on them. There's just valley oaks. And he just decides to go up to the top of a mountain where you just essentially have to clear cut everything, dynamite stuff into place. Like, it's a massive, massive undertaking. And he goes, no, I think we're going to put the vineyard here. I mean, like, to have that level of like either madness and foresight at the same time in the mid 1880s is something that I just always think of whenever I'm driving up Moon Mountain Road to go there and be like, who would have thought that this would have been the place to put it? But man, he was right. It's one of the great vineyards of California.
Yeah, because it feels pretty rustic and remote now.
It does.
150 years later.
No, it's unbelievable. I mean, and the views, I mean, you still get these panoramic views all the way down to Mount Tamalpais and into the San Pablo Bay. And I mean, it is stunning, but somehow you're just perched right above the town of Sonoma. You still feel, you know, isolated from everything. And I mean, you look at the wildlife. I mean, I've been driving around there and you see deer that has been like taken down by mountain lions and stuff. And you're like, you are definitely, you know, right on the edge of sort of mountain wilderness in many ways. So it's pretty cool.
And this wine, it's not unlike, I mean, it's not Palo Verga, of course, but I mean, It is not a massively powerful wine. And these wines have that ability to age for decades, which they must age on their combination of acidity and structure. But I mean, the wine has incredibly bright fruit and very red, and very Zinfandel, but it's not at all like super concentrated or powerful wine.
Right. And, and I think that, we've changed the way that we've gone at making this wine over the years, in part because Monte Rosso is kind of a tricky wine to figure out when to pick. The reason for that is that because it's on the mountainside, mountain fruit tends to, not to get too technical, but respire acidity differently than valley floor fruit. So as a result, the grapes typically have a lot of malic acid in them, and that malic acid goes away during malolactic, but it also makes the fruit taste very, very tart early on. So what we've learned, and what I've learned over time, is that if I actually wait to get to a flavor profile in the fruit that I think would be perfectly ripe at a normal site, it actually, by the time that wine goes through malolactic and all that acidity goes away, it actually tastes overripe. And so this is the one vineyard that I always feel like I'm calling the pick on maybe 3 to 4 days earlier than I typically would be thinking I would, just because I know that I want to maintain as much of that freshness. And looking back at the great vintages that my dad made, 93, 94, 99, those are all years that, were relatively even, but also had a lot of freshness attached to them. And you just get this, this really ebullient perfume out of the wine. There's almost always something that's almost like citrusy, like warm years, it's almost Cointreau-y, and in cooler, fresher years, like 18, it's almost citrus blossom or something like that, which is very unique to the site.
Yeah, I think of kind of blood orange, it's like citrus, but with a red component.
Totally.
And doesn't Zinfandel have this issue where it can soak up? Like you think you're picking it at like X degree, and then you end up in the tank with something that's 0.5 or 1% higher?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very funny because one of my favorite winemaking books in the world was actually written in 1888 by this guy named George Hussman in Napa. And he's talking about Zinfandel. And in it, he's like, well, Zinfandel, if you pick it at 12.5% potential alcohol, it'll invariably soak up to 13.5% alcohol in the tank. And, and he's literally describing everything that we deal with to this day with Zinfandel, but it was known about in 1888. And it's absolutely true. I mean, because of the uneven cluster morphology of Zinfandel, where you'll get these sort of big shoulder berries that sort of are like red and a little bit unripe, but then you'll get all these little chicks that we call them, these small berries that will be a little bit raisined. The initial sugar that it hits the tank at definitely changes over the first 2 to 3 days that, that must is soaking, as a little bit of that sugar is pulled out of those raisins. So we always sort of assume that the fruit is always, usually about a degree riper than we actually think it is in terms of potential alcohol. And, for us, we really value freshness. It's really easy to get sunshine and power in California, and particularly in Zinfandel. So it's something that we're always cognizant of, particularly in warm years where sometimes that soak factor can be a little higher than we would like. But yeah, it's the trick of Zinfandel, and then you throw the layer of the trick of Monte Rosso on top of it. And it's definitely a vineyard that sort of teaches you how to make it over time. And I've just been very fortunate to have had some years up there to, figure that out so far.
Really cool. While we're on the subject of winemaking, we have a question which is regards whole cluster and Zinfandel. Do you have a philosophy to that that's sort of overarching, or is it more vintage specific or site specific? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so whole cluster with Zinfandel is really interesting. So we use a lot of whole cluster when it comes to Mataro, Grenache, Carignan, a lot of the more traditional Mediterranean and Rhone grapes that we bring in. I've typically shied away from doing whole cluster with Zinfandel because, one, I find that the fruit generally has a lot of spice to begin with, which is one of the things that you can really push with some of the whole cluster element. I also don't like an element of greenness in the wine, which I've always been afraid of. But that being said, over the last 3 to 4 years, we've been starting to experiment with more and more cluster. And in fact, one of the reasons for it was I tasted this wine that Bob Bialy made for his dad on his anniversary. And it was just made in this very old-fashioned way where they took the fruit and they literally just put it through a hand crank crusher, like old Italian homemade wine style. So all the clusters, all the stalks, everything went in with it. And it was one of the best Napa Zinfandels that I've ever had. And so I was like, okay, well, that kind of recalibrates my thinking about, what we want to do in terms of cluster for Zinfandel. So, in the last couple of years, we've had lots that we've pulled to the side where we've even done 80 to 100% whole cluster on some Old Hill lots, on some Bedrock lots, on some stuff from Evangelo Vineyard, places where you have a little bit more fruit to play with. So if it's terrible, we don't need to like really suffer the consequences. And I've been really happy with the results. And in fact, I think in 2019, we tasted through all of our lots recently, and the 100% whole cluster lot that we did from Old Hill Ranch was really good, and it's going to make it into the final wine. So, our thoughts on it are continuing to evolve. But I think it. On one hand, I think you have like the classic thinking about the way Zinfandel has always been made, but then you think about Zinfandel as a Mediterranean grape, and you look at the way that so many Mediterranean red grapes have been treated over time, which includes whole cluster. And so it makes totally intuitive sense from that side that you would potentially want to go in that direction. So, it's something that we continue to, play with as we're moving forward. I think we're going to play with it more.
That's super fascinating. Before we go down to the valley,
Yeah.
quite a few people have asked for your views on 2019. So the 18s are just being released, but I guess people are very thirsty and impatient. So
yeah.
But I guess I'm curious too. So what's the story with 19? How do you feel about the vintage?
It's really interesting. So 2018 and 2019 were both relatively large volume vintages, particularly compared to like 17 and 15 and 16, which was a little bit sort of more on par. But other than that, they're pretty different. So 18 was this very uniform vintage. We had no heat spikes through anything at any point. Natural acidity stayed up. They're very fresh. We had really good skin development. It's an absolutely phenomenal vintage. 19, we did have some heat spikes, but the nice thing about actually having a little bit more fruit on the vine than normal is that, particularly with Zinfandel, is that it really weathered those heat spikes better. Like for the worst case scenario, when you're making Zinfandel, in my opinion, is having a year where you actually have really low crops, and then all of a sudden that Labor Day heat spike eventually invariably comes, and you've got 5 to 6 days of 95-degree heat or 105-degree heat, and everything jumps from 21 bricks to 24.5 bricks, and you're just like, we have to pick everything, whether it's ready to go or not, because the potential alcohols are skyrocketing so high. So we didn't experience that in 2019. I would say that we did see some larger berry sizes than typical. So the wines themselves are really, really nice. They're very forward. They're very sort of gentle. In many ways, they remind me a little bit of 2012s or 2007s, or even some of the 97s when it comes to Zinfandel, to go like way, way, way back, but another larger crop year. And I think that if the 18s are going to be wines that are really have a lot of tension and energy and are going to age extraordinarily well, I think the 19s are going to be wines that are going to be really pleasurable out of the gate. 18 was a year where I felt like almost every lot was, we just were like, this could be the best it ever was. 19 was a little bit more variable, and, we're going to have to earn our paychecks a little bit more. But, the nice thing for us being so diversified from Amador County to Contra Costa County to Sonoma and Napa is that we can really sort of play to the strengths of the year. And there's definitely some really nice stuff that came in 19. So
Cool.
how's that for a wishy-washy answer? So
great answer. And it leads to sort of the next question, which is on the subject of drinking windows. There's a question about, have you thought about providing a drinkability chart for your website or for your members to help me? Because you make a lot of wines. I mean, the last time I saw you, I was like, okay, Morgan shows up with one case of wine. Okay, fine. Second box, I'm like, okay, that's kind of normal. Third box, oh my God.
As you said, though, it wasn't 2 vintages worth at Turley. So it wasn't the near-death experience. So
2 vintages at Turley back to back. That was a near-death experience.
Yeah.
So, 35 wines this year that we tasted.
Yeah, we tasted through a lot of wines. And in part, it was just because 2018 was so strong that we really wanted to lean into it. But regarding the vintage data, the drinking windows, we do try to provide those on the releases. I realize we haven't been totally consistent about it. It's interesting. I always go back and forth on drinking windows because I feel like people's own taste, particularly when it comes to Zinfandel, is so, it varies so much, because if people grew up drinking, I think like Old Ravenswood, Ridge, early Rosenbloom, Green and Red, Storybook Mountain, Swan, these wines that are really ones that can like have been able to, that were made in a very classic style and have been very age worthy, then all of a sudden I think those people can really like lean into those wines and be like, wow, this is really going to get better 10, 15, or 20 years out. But then there's a lot of people that kind of think about Zinfandel as this wine that you just kind of drink, that it's very forward and juicy and it's just meant for immediate pleasure. So like finding the balance between those two things is a little bit hard. Our wines, I think, lean more towards that older fashioned style because we put so much value on freshness. But at the same time, they're made in a more modern way. They have a little bit more oak, so they're also a little bit fleshier and more forward. So and I know my dad would always drink wines 5 to 8 years older than I would. So it's a very personal decision. So at some point I'm going like, well, is the drinking window on the 2018, 2022 to 2040? And then at what point does it really mean anything? But I would say that in a general rule for the heritage wines, I really like to give them 5 to 7 years. And I really think that at that point, you find the integration of oak, a little bit of that secondary character coming out. And I feel like those wines really knit well at that point. But then certain wines, Pagani, Bedrock, most of the Sonoma Valley wines, along with, Lorenzo's and Nervo and a couple others that we make, those really are going to age, I think, really, really quite well. We've been making these wines for 13 years now. And it has been really nice to see that even the wines we made in a slightly riper style in 2007 through 2010, they've aged really well. So I'm now starting to have hope that these wines are going to age really well. At some point, though, as a young winemaker, I feel like it's kind of the height of arrogance to be like, this wine's going to go 40 years. Like, this is going to be a vin de garde. Because, I mean, we don't really know. I have my guesses, but, we're sort of now, I think, being able to understand exactly what these wines are going to do a little better. So.
Yeah, I think people of your dad's generation were generally accustomed to drinking wines older because it was more possible to do that.
Yes.
And it's just, people of our generation, it's possible, but you have to be really wealthy.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I think there's a lot of, and I think the wines are cleaner. The fruit is cleaner. The farming is better. The wineries are cleaner. So these wines, when they're bottled, I mean, I just tasted your 18 Monterosso, and it is probably a 40-year wine, but you could drink it tonight. It's not a crime, right. But that may not have been possible,
well,
a generation ago.
And we're going to talk about Old Hill Ranch. I mean, Dad openly says, when he was making those wines from the 80s, that vineyard was in pretty bad shape, and he was getting 1/4 to 1/2 ton an acre out of that vineyard. And those wines were impossibly tannic when they were young. Like, they were really, really hard to drink, and they're glorious now. But I do think that, I think that we've gotten better I think the farming is really the big part of it. Like, farming's gotten so much better. But then also, winemaking has adapted and developed over time. So we are able to sort of straddle those two things a little bit better than maybe some of those more rustic examples from the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. So let's go to the valley floor and check out your vineyard, Bedrock Vineyard. And,
yeah.
Which is the next, we're going to taste some of these wines and talk about them, but Bedrock is your estate vineyard.
It is.
And now we're really on the valley floor.
Yes.
This is the map that we've.
Well, and this map's great because you actually have Monterosso with on the left there pointed out. So you can kind of see the little valley that comes down where all the soil runs off of the Moon Mountain district, basically. And this lands on the valley floor where Bedrock is.
Yeah.
And yeah, this part of Sonoma Valley is really kind of like, my dad calls it the banana belt. It's just sort of this, this really beautiful section of alluvial soils that have this really wonderful mixture of cobble and gravel, but then also enough clay, which allows us to essentially dry farm the vines. And why it's been planted and actively planted for so long. I mean, our vineyard was first planted in 1854 by General Joseph Hooker. It, like everything, was decimated by phylloxera in the 1870s. It was replanted a couple of times in the 1880s by Eli T. Shepard. And then Our vines were planted in between 1888 and 1892 by Senator George Hearst, who bought the property in 1887. So, it's been known to be a pretty great place to grow grapes for a really long time. I even found this quote from Eugene Hilgard in the 1890s. So Hilgard was sort of the head of what became University of California, Davis. He's kind of like the godfather of the modern science of Zinfandel. And somebody actually asked him where he thought the best grapes could be grown in California. And he actually said the bench of red soil above Agua Caliente owned by Senator Hearst. Which I think is pretty incredible. I also think Senator Hearst was donating a lot of money to the University of California at the time. So that may have also had something to do with it, but I'll take the quote. It's good.
No, it sounds good.
Yeah.
So here's, for reference, here's Sonoma Highway. So this is the part that most people would happen to see. And then this is, as I recall, the poorer soils are here by the road. And then as you get more towards the creek, the soil gets heavier and more fertile, which is kind of which is what happens in places typically around the world. Your Zin is right here.
Yeah, and this is the lime green there.
Yeah, this is the lime green areas where the Zinfandel is. And what is is it all, I don't remember, is it all Zin for this wine, the heritage wine?
So we have 27 different varieties that go into this. So it's one of the more diverse vineyards that we work with. The backbone of it is Zinfandel. The wine usually is between 50 and 55% Zinfandel, followed by Carignan, followed by Mataro, Mourvedre, Monastrell, we call it Mataro typically, and then everything else that goes into it. And, these old vineyards here all over California are really amazing because not only do they have this incredible wealth of old varieties that go into them, we've also found varieties in our mapping of these vines that either have no matching genetic fingerprint to anything that's left in the world, or there's varieties that we found that are nearly extinct where they originally came from, but due to the aridity of the climate in California, the vines tend to live a bit longer. So here at Bedrock, we have Becquenol Blanc. We have a variety called Castet, which is from the Gironde. And it's interesting because as the authorities in Bordeaux are looking at what varieties they want to plant to combat global warming, this little variety Castet, of which I believe there's only a hectare left planted in the Gironde, is actually on that list of varieties that's now going to be accepted to go into basic Bordeaux, not like classed Bordeaux, but the basic Bordeaux plantings as one of the varieties they think will sort of stand up to climate change. And we have 2 vines of that at Bedrock for whatever the reason. But we have Syrah, Petit Syrah, Alicante, Grand Noir, Trousseau Noir, and it kind of goes on and on in terms of what we've found out there. So it's a very traditional field blend. Everything gets picked together in these field blends for the most part and gets co-fermented, which we think is a really effective way to build complexity into the wine. It's also, I think, another way that we can sort of battle the tendency of Zinfandel to go towards ripeness, because we've got later ripening varieties like Mataro and Carignan and Grenache and Syrah that will bring that sort of relative sugar down and don't have that tendency to raisin and soak up in tanks. So it's a way that we can create balance. And if you look back to the writings of the 1880s of the California State Viticultural Commission, they were advocating growing field blends for that very same reason. They're like, you'll create a more stable wine, you'll have better color, you'll do all these things. And it absolutely plays out 130 years later. The one difference with Bedrock is that we do that deep purple block, that little deep purple block up above the lime green there. That's a block of very, very old vine Carignan. It's one of the best blocks of Carignan that we work with, and we're very fortunate in that we work with a few pretty great Carignan vineyards. And to me, that's kind of the secret sauce for Bedrock. It really provides spice, perfume, lift, and also remarkable color. And so we usually pick that about 7 to 9 days after everything else, because it ripens a little later. And we blend that back into the wine. But other than that, everything else is co-fermented and picked together.
When I taste the wines from Bedrock, the vineyard, they always have this breadth, these sort of broad shoulders, and this sort of, the Monte Rosso is much more airy and not quite as big a wine, but this at Bedrock, we always have wines that are a little bit more ample and broad, they're stocky in build. Is that a soil thing? Is it, you think it's the kind of Zinfandel, the yields? What makes that wine always like that?
You know, for me, I think it's the soil types that has something to do with it. I think it's just Sonoma Valley in general, but I also think it has to do with the mixed blacks. I think that when you see the Syrah and the Mataro and the Alicante, I think that that imparts almost like this Rhone-ish chunkiness to the wines sometimes. And so I think that that has the most to do with it, because I would agree. I think that when you look at Bedrock, whether it's made by Tegan at Turley, or whether it's made by Mike Officer, or whether it's made by Jake at Limerick Lane, or Bob Bialy, there is this thread that runs through them, that the wines always have this this sort of heft and to them. And I do think that that's sort of, endemic to the site. And what's interesting too is it's really fun to sell to all those different winemakers, because they're extraordinarily good at what they do. But at the same time, you have people like when Wild Farm makes it, Pax is picking at, 22 and a half bricks. And then when some of the riper people are picking, they're picking it at 27. And yet at the same time, you see that same thread run through all of those wines, which I think is really fascinating. So yeah, it's interesting. Just to, that you just do see that, but I think it probably has something to do with the mixed blacks and just sort of like the percentage of them and the amount of carrying on a Mataro that's out there. That would be my best guess.
But so I guess there's two different kinds of field blends, right? There's a field blend where like the different varieties are interplanted.
Yeah.
And then there's a field blend like this where the varieties are more or less indifferent in their own distinguished separate parcels. Now, how do you manage the ripening and sort of pick it so that everything is ripe enough that it's going to ferment properly together?
Yeah. So when I consider field blend, I usually kind of consider it everything that's grown together in the same blocks. And so what that lime green area that says Zinfandel on it, we call that Zinfandel because it's, the blocks are typically majority Zinfandel, but they're anywhere from 15 to 40% mixed blacks. So we're sort of looking, and the same goes for Old Hill Ranch, and the same goes for Pagani. So the picking decision is really tricky. I think it's one of the things that you sort of glean from experience. I think that you obviously look at the dominant variety, which in most cases is Zinfandel, and kind of see where that is. And then, at some point, you're almost not even looking at flavor. You're almost looking at the vines themselves. Like Tegan and I always talk about the fact that there's these points at which we'll drive into vineyards, and we'll be in that vineyard every day or every other day for 2-3 weeks going into, potential harvest. And then you just drive into the vineyard one day and the canopies just look a little different. Like the leaves are holding themselves a little differently. The vines feel like there's a little bit more sag to them, everything. And at that point you're like, okay, it's time to pick. And invariably, so it's almost like this combination between seeing and tasting what's on the vine, but and I'll steal this from my dad because he has always said that holding on the fine tradition of Peterson stealing from other people. But he always says that, picking these old vines are almost like you're picking like on Gestalt in some ways. There's a feel to the vineyard. And once you start really knowing the vineyards well enough, you kind of just be like, okay, this is where this is going to be this year. And then you kind of know when it's ready to go. And, and that sounds a little hippy dippy, but at the same time, I kind of hear the same thing whenever I talk to other winemakers that I respect all over the world. I remember Jean-Charles Abatucci in Corsica essentially saying the exact same thing about when to pick Chocarello. And so, there's sort of like this, it's clearly something that's there, and that you just kind of get a feel for in some ways.
That's cool. Before we move on to Old Hill, I'm just curious because I don't remember from when I was out there last, this white part, does it belong to you or is it fallow?
The white part on the other side of the creek?
Yeah.
That doesn't belong to us. So that is part of the old Hunter family farms. So that used to be some sparkling wine that was made there.
I remember it not being part of Bedrock, but I wasn't 100% sure.
Yeah, no, I would, if we could extend that area on the other side of the creek is pretty heavy, deep soils. It'd be really good for growing veggies, but then you get right up above there and there's some really, really nice soils up against Arnold Drive there. But dare to dream.
But I meant this part here, these white blocks.
Oh, the white blocks. So yeah, so that was historically part of Bedrock. So, or what was at one point known as Madrone Ranch. And it also included the whole area on the other side to the north there, which was Valley of the Moon Estates. And so the estate was originally divided in 1954, and Valley of the Moon, owned by the Parduccis, took the northern section, and the Domenicis, who we bought the vineyard from, took what is now known as Bedrock Vineyard. The area in the center was subdivided later off in the late 60s and early 70s. And two of those blocks there are actually very old vines that are the same age as Bedrock, and that's known as Berisha Vineyard. So that's a vineyard that went to my dad's starting in 94, and prior to that went to the guys up at Kenwood, and they vineyard designated that for, I think, maybe almost like 15 years. So
so we'll have that all on our big map when that comes out.
yeah, exactly.
It's all that stuff on it. I got to ask you, because a few people have asked the same question. I'm curious too. What about all the Merlot that you have there? Where does that end up going?
Anybody want it? No, those are down on heavier soils. And so we have traditionally sold those to Sini and Clos de Bois and a couple other producers like that. They love it, but I mean, those aren't like what I would consider to be the highest quality soils on the ranch. And that's just the reality of farming. We bought the vineyard for the old vines, and then the other section on the north side there, which is the light gray, which is now open field, which we're redeveloping. Those are incredible soils, but sometimes what comes with it are ones that are not quite as high quality. The tip below the Merlot there, we are gradually redeveloping, and so that's actually, I'm really excited. We're actually planting some Portuguese whites there that I think are going to do well given the heat of Sonoma Valley. So things like Viaggino and Orinto and Gouveio and Rabagatto, and then a few other odds and ends. So we're gradually sort of redeveloping the Merlot blocks in Bedrock Wine Company's crazy funhouse mirror image of what we think we want to make. So it's certainly going to become more diversified over the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any property in the world where every piece of it is perfect. There's going to be places that you like more, that you like less, that are better suited to what you want to do, and that's just the way it is.
I mean, you look at Burgundy, and the areas down along the highway are, it's only a couple feet difference, but it makes a huge, it makes a huge impact on quality, and the same can be said for any place else. So yeah, but if anybody wants Merlot, let us know. So.
Wow, what an offer. Cool. Yeah. All right, so this would be a really good time, I think, to sort of transition and talk a little bit about Old Hill, which is a magical vineyard. And that is, again, super field blend.
Yes.
This is a map that Alessandro Masnaghetti, who's our cartographer, drew of this vineyard. It's a draft, so it's more like a sketch. The other maps are like, fully done. We've used them in public tastings, and this is more like something I just said, hey, would you mind doing this? And he just made this draft for us so that we would have something to talk about. But these are the field blend blocks here, the red.
Yes. So Old Hill is farmed by Will Buckland. And I don't know if you've got that photo to put up.
Yeah, I'm going to put up right now.
But gives you a pretty good idea of the culture that is at, let's see, there we go. Yeah, so that's actually, so the 2018 that we're trying right now, that's actually, that's the day of the harvest. So that's my dad being hugged by Will Buckland, who is the guy who takes care of the vineyard, and he's one of the best human beings I know. The older gentleman with the big beard is Phil Katuri, so very well-known organic vineyard guru. The younger gentleman with the big beard in front of him is my joyous business partner, Chris. And then the younger guy next to me is Jake Newstead, our really talented viticulturist. But this, I think, I love this shot because it pretty much sums up how we all feel about Old Hill, and particularly Old Hill Ranch sort of coming back to the Peterson family fold, because this is my dad's longest standing vineyard designated vineyard. He started making this wine in 1984 for Ravenswood. And then, of course, he wrote such a bulletproof contract that he himself couldn't even get out of it to sell himself more fruit once he left Ravenswood. So the irony is I've been going to this vineyard since I was 3 years old. Like my earliest memories of harvest are at Old Hill Ranch. And it's the very last one of sort of the very old 1880s planted Sonoma Crews that sort of came to the Bedrock fold. So to me, it's one of the greatest old vineyards, not just in California, but in the world. It's just really, really expressive. It is old field blend. It's got over 30 different varieties. But what I think is really fascinating about Old Hill is that unlike Bedrock, where sort of like after Zinfandel, the super second variety is like Carignan and then Mataro. And then you go to Pagani and like the varieties are like Petite Straw and Alicante and Grand Noir and all these very dark varieties. Old Hill is the only place in Sonoma where you see a huge proportion of Grenache. So the big second at Old Hill is Grenache. So I think that really combines really almost ethereal perfume to the wine and this structure. And I think it's one of the reasons why it is so age-worthy. But you also see Syrah and Petite Straw. And then what's the craziest thing that we found when we started doing genetic testing on this is that there's this cabal of Savoie varieties that are planted in this vineyard, that some of the varieties are essentially non-existent even in the Savoie, but you have Mollard, you have Persan, you have Etré de la Douy, you also have Corbeau, which is known as Charbonneau as well, and Mondeuse. And so you have all of these in this vineyard. And so, to me, in even years, you just get this incredible like violet, tinge, these beautiful perfume and aromatics that I think come from this Grenache and also these sort of mountain varieties that you find here. And they make for a really, really compelling wine. The 2018 Old Hill, I mean, not in part, it's just the sheer excitement over getting to make it myself for the first time, or ourselves. But on top of that, it being such an incredible vintage, it is one of my favorite wines that we've ever made, and I think it's going to last a really, really quite a long time. So it's very unique. What's also really interesting, I mean, as the bird flies, Old Hill Ranch is less than a third of a mile from Bedrock. It's just sort of in like the next alluvial wash north off of Mount Beater and the Moon Mountain AVA onto the valley floor. But what's really unique about Old Hill is that it's been farmed organically since the 1960s. The soil health is unbelievable, and Will Buckland is, I think, one of the most thoughtful organic farmers that I know. Much of our own vineyard practice at our own vineyards at Bedrock and Nervo and Evangelo and Sodini and all the vineyards that we farm now is really predicated heavily upon what we saw Will do when he came back to the ranch in 2000 and completely transformed this really scraggly, sort of struggling vineyard in many ways into what it is now, which is just this pinnacle of health and beauty. It's like one of the most alive places. The moment you set foot into it, it just feels different, which is, a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely how I felt when I went there, when Alessandro and I started to work on this map. There's incredible vegetation and flowers, and it is a place where you feel some emotional thing. It's just really crazy. When I taste the wine, it is intensely aromatic. I wanted to ask you, are there white grapes in there too? Do you think?
I mean, there's white grapes in most of these different field blends. And there, believe it or not, there's some actually very old Chardonnay in this vineyard. It's about the most shopberry Chardonnay I've ever seen, to the point where I think it has about 6 clusters per vine that are about this big. But I think a lot of that perfume comes both from the Grenache and that and those Alpine varieties in some ways, which is just pretty amazing to see that you can have that much. And to me, there's sort of like this hint of pepper in it that isn't like that rotundant that you would see like with Syrah, but I do feel like you get a little bit of that inflection in it, almost like fennel and licorice, and it's a pretty fascinating site.
Yeah, I mean, the aromatics are really fantastic, really beautiful, really lifted. Why don't we go to Pagani
Yep.
and we'll take a look at that, because that's a really cool site as well. So this is the other map that we did. And while people get a chance to look at this, I'll answer a question that's for me, which is which one of these wines got the highest score? And the answer is I have no idea, because once I write something, I don't ever look at it again. So I don't really love the whole scoring thing, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to people like Morgan. They indulge all my questions, and I love tasting the wines, but the number thing is just, I mean, I think it's important for people to take a stand and to express an opinion, and that's the best thing about whole scoring thing. But to me, I really am trying to understand the essence of each place and to communicate that, and then at the end there's a number. But to me, it's much more fun to understand the difference between these wines contextually, and the texture, the aromatics, the structure. That's infinitely more interesting than some number that some wine got. And I say that being somebody who makes their living doing that. Once I write it, I don't ever look at it again. So the answer is I don't know which one got the highest score. Pagani. So take a look at this map, which is really cool, right? Because here, you can see what we did here was that we did a map where we show each block and the varieties. Here we had, it just depends on the kind of information that we have from each grower and each owner. But here we had incredible amount of detail that we were able to chart. And not everybody honestly wants this scene necessarily. I mean, it's not an issue in Sonoma, but in a place like Napa Valley, nobody would ever want a map that's with this much detail for public use.
Yeah.
But it's another reason why I love spending time in Sonoma. It's just there's just much more openness. And so here's an example of this historic vineyard block by block with the percentages. And I know it's hard to read for people watching, but it just gives you an example of how diverse it is just within that tiny little vineyard. So to you, Morgan, what are the signatures? And just so everybody's looking, your wine comes from these blocks here, plus a little bit of this Alicante, if I recall.
Yeah, exactly.
But what's the attraction to you of this site?
Well, Pagani is, it's amazing because it's the most distant of these four, meaning that it is 2 miles north of Bedrock. I mean, we're still within the snug confines of Sonoma Valley here, but it is just a much different world in many ways as you get out of Glen Ellen and you move up to Kenwood. The fog comes through here later. You get more effect off of the Bennett Gap rather than San Pablo Bay. And because the fog tends to arrive later, you have less of the insulating effect of that fog, which means that the nights tend to be a lot colder, but also the days tend to be quite a bit warmer. So that in and of itself changes the profile a lot. And then on top of that, I think that the way that you set this map up is perfect because instead of Mount Veeder being in the background, you have Sonoma Mountain in the background. And so the back part of this ranch where our fruit comes from, block 32 and block 26, and 35, is all soil that is derived off of the Sonoma Valley or off the Sonoma mountainside. So unlike Old Hill and Bedrock and Monte Rosa, where you're on these very iron rich, very red soils, here you're on soils that are almost just like white. They're like white to gray. They have a lot more ash in them. The soils are not as deep in some situations, and there's also a lot less cobble. So I think that that completely changes the mouthfeel. And then on top of that, the varietal mix here is completely different than you see at Bedrock or Old Hill. Here, after Zinfandel, the most prominent varieties are Alicante Boucher, Petit Syrah, Grand Noir. There's a little bit of Mataro, and there's actually things like Aramon and Mission and some very, very old varieties. If I had to guess, I would say that this is the oldest of the 4 vineyards because we've also seen that it's not on St. George rootstock, which started to be used in 1887, but it's actually on a variety called Lenoir, which is a Vitis estibellus grape that was used prior to that. And it could be used both as a rootstock and a direct producer. So there's actually some Lenoir in this vineyard from where the scion, the grafted on vine had died off, and they've actually raised the Lenoir up. So I'd say that this wine is every year 1 to 2% actually non-vinifera grapes, which is really interesting. And then, and the other really interesting thing is that Petit Syrah was introduced to the state of California in 1882 at a guy named J.H. Drummond's nursery, which is literally across the street from Pagani Ranch, where Beltane Ranch is now. And I think that that probably accounts for the fact that we see a lot of Petit Syrah here at Pagani, which I think really makes the wine a lot more darkly inflected. It always is the most powerful, deep, the most densely colored of all of the Sonoma Valley wines year in and year out. And I think the trick with Pagani sometimes is finding a way to balance that just raw, brutish power with also enough grace and high tone character to really make it and turn it into a complete wine. Whereas I think sometimes at Bedrock or Monte Rosso, maybe it's the opposite. You're always going to have the perfume in spades, but it's trying to fill out the bottom of the wine in some ways that is the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, this wine is very complete because you have the breadth and the volume and the concentration that you might find in a Bedrock wine, but it's also incredibly aromatic,
yes,
and very perfumey. And I mean, there's a number of people who make wines off this ranch, not a huge number, but a few. And to me, it's always just so distinctive, and what's amazing is that these places are so close to each other and the wines are so different. I mean, some of it is the soil, some of it is obviously these varietal mixes are different, but still, I mean, you could spend a whole lifetime trying to understand what's in that glass.
Yep. I mean, and that's what I'm trying to do.
You and me both. No, I know.
And yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's very true. And it is amazing too. I think in part it's because Pagani is so well known because of the great ridge wines that have been made with it starting in the early 90s. But I mean, unlike any vineyard that we work with, and even compared to Monte Rosso or Tedeschi or, some other pretty well-known ranches, people just gravitate towards Pagani in a way that, I just don't see with anything else. If we pour 4 wines at Zap or some big tasting like that, everybody's just like, you have a Pagani? And it's like, just because, I don't know, maybe it's just really fun to say, but at the same time, it really seems to have captured people's hearts in a way that's clearly unique from my vantage point, at least.
Yeah. And so this is why I always am such a pain in the, about not changing the names of vineyards, because that reaction is elicited by the track record of all of the great wines that have been made from that vineyard in the decades and generations prior. Yeah. And if you don't have that, then you don't get that reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So, no, and I mean, I think that speaks towards any number of things. I think it speaks to the protected name conversation you had with the McDonald's on Monday regarding To Kalon. I mean, like, there's a lot. Names are powerful things, and they're tied to a lot of human experience, and they're important to be protected and respected.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of great questions here. This one is really great from John about, obviously, climate change is a big issue in the world of wine. How does climate change impact these older vineyards and these field blends? Are they more susceptible, less susceptible? What's your experience been?
My feeling is that field blends are going to be less susceptible. And I say that in part because of one of the reasons why they were originally planted was that they were almost like an insurance policy. When you think about what was being planted in the 1880s, people were planting these new vinifera varieties that they had never had any experience before, because prior to that, everybody was growing Mission in California. And they didn't really know what they were going to get. They didn't know when things were going to ripen. They had very limited means to combat powdery mildew and botrytis and all the same diseases that we deal with now. And in many ways, by building diversity into their vineyards, they were building an insurance policy. So, if the Carignan was heavily hit by powdery mildew, which it will be almost every year, then at the same time, the Mataro is probably going to be okay, or the Syrah is going to be okay. And then you also have this variation of ripening points. So not only do I think that that can lend itself to complexity. I think this idea that uniformity is somehow best is, I think, sort of a part of a modernism in winemaking that I don't think is necessarily true. But, you know, I also think that it built, you know, sort of some risk averseness into the model. And so I think that it's actually going to be very helpful in terms of just helping to smooth out some of what we see in terms of climate change. It's, you know, but at the same time, it's really hard to say, because there's climate models now too that show that, you know, if the interior heats up, it potentially actually makes the coastal areas where we are foggier, wetter, and colder, because it's going to pull that much more fog in off of the coast, which is what happens when the San Joaquin Valley heats up in the summer. So it's really hard to sort of know what was going on, but I would say that anytime you've got diversification in any system, any agricultural system, any stock portfolio, anything, I mean, I think that that's probably something that lends itself towards protecting yourself against, you know, potentially things going poorly.
Yeah, because that's a really interesting cultural observation, because if you go to somewhere like Napa Valley during the harvest, the whole point is to have grapes that are all exactly the same.
Blueberries.
Whereas somewhere like Burgundy, blueberries, yeah. Whereas if you go to Burgundy, what they prize is, you know, chicks and peas, or chicks and hens. They want diversity, the big juicy berry with the fruit, with the size, and then the small berry with the concentration and the thicker skins and the higher ratio of skin to juice. And so it's quite interesting that what is prized in one place is kind of the opposite of what's prized in another place, and it's cultural, and it's obviously that's going to end up in your wine.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting to see where you see this movement in certain areas of people really going back to embracing field blends. I mean, whether it's Jean-Michel Dice in Alsace that's now interplanting all of his great vineyards with many, many different varieties, because he feels like he's trying to make these great, you know, examples of sight. Or if you go to the Douro, which it just amazes me, the most expensive wines that you can get in the Douro of still reds are these insane old field blends of 20 to 30 varieties. And they've really, really leaned. And I mean, not only are they expensive, they're extraordinarily good wines. So it's interesting to just see where people have sort of decided to lean into those. And I think that, like in the Southern Rhone, you're seeing a movement away from that movement in the 80s and 90s where people were really just saying it's Grenache, it's Grenache, it's Grenache, it's Grenache. And now you see people like the Perrins and other families being like, oh man, maybe just pure Grenache is not that good with the onset of global climate change. Maybe it's really good that we have this diversity in the vineyards. And so you're seeing a bit more of a movement back in that direction. So, you know, it is, as you said, cultural and very specific to, I think, the objectives of what people are trying to do as well.
Mm-hmm. What about, obviously we've talked about 4 wines. We're going to taste your wedding wine, which is a very unique wine. But before we get to that, what about things that haven't worked? What, has there been a site or a vintage or a wine that you made where at the end of the day, you say, well, this is really a learning experience, and you took away something from something that didn't, well, yeah, that's true of all of us, but what's an example of something where you sort of said, well, maybe I would have done this differently?
So single-handedly, the worst one I have ever made is I tried to make carbonically macerated Sauvignon Blanc, and it is god-awful. It smelled like, I can't, it like, because the pH bumped on it, it was like, it tasted like soap. It was horrendous. Don't do that if anybody's listening and has the opportunity to do it. You know, I think some of the things what I've learned from an experimental side, I think mainly has a lot to do with élevage and has a lot to do with oak. I think that, you know, as a winemaker, you have this capacity, you know, wine by definition is an intervention, right? You have decided to plant a vineyard in a given spot. You have decided to treat it in a certain way. You've decided to put in these cultural practices, whether it's leafing, whether it's de-winging, doing all these different things. And then it comes into the winery, and then you have all the decisions of whether you're going to destem or not destem, or whether you're going to use indigenous yeast, or whether you're going to inoculate, and then you're going to decide what you're going to put it into. And I think the thing that, you know, it's really easy to be almost like an activist winemaker, where you're just going to be like, I am going to affect change on this wine, and I'm going to see myself in this wine, because, you know, that's a pretty compelling, amazing ego stroke to actually see. So early on, I think that we used too much oak on our wines. I think that there were things that, you sort of fall in love with like what you can do. And I think that the part of the maturation, and, this is something that I've talked with many other, colleagues of, a part of the process is almost figuring out how you like lift yourself out of it. And so like what I've learned for myself is that the more we farm and the more that I'm in the vineyards, the less that I'm in the winery and I have the desire to actually mess around with stuff. It's actually like better for my own sanity and for the finished wines that I'm not there just trying to like meddle. And I'd rather be, out doing those things. And then, I mean, I think I'm trying to, there's so many, there's just, I mean, there's been some wines that we've released that I think, were interesting to make in and of themselves, but they're not, there's certain wines that I find that I just don't drink that much. And that to me is probably a pretty good indication that I shouldn't be making them. So that's, if that, yeah.
That's a really candid answer. So thank you for that. I'm sure that everybody appreciates that, as do I. I think it's great. One of the things we haven't talked about, was we've been so focused on these wines, is Syrahs. So there's a question about drinkability. Like, what do you think the drinking window is for your Syrah wines?
Yeah, I mean, Syrah, to me, what's been amazing about the Syrahs that we've made, even, going back to 08 and 09 when we were making them in a slightly larger style, is that Syrah just seems to have this enormous, almost like antioxidant capacity. Like it really ages really well. So for me, like I'm really finding that our 08, our 09s are drinking really well. 2011s, which, obviously not considered by, to be maybe like the apogee of California potential, but I think like our 2011 Kick Ranch is drinking really, really nicely right now. So, I think that you get into, that, I think that you start looking 5, 7, 9 years out. And particularly in sites like Griffin's Lair, which tends to be a really high structure site. I think that, seeing the 2010s, 11s, and 12s of that starting to unfurl just now is a pretty good indication of, them coming into their drinking window. The Hudson wines, they're a little higher pH. They tend to be a little softer. I think that those open up a little sooner. And so like right now, I think like the 2015 Hudson is even starting to like come into its own a little bit. So it's just sort of a function of, again, it's a function of what you like, but at the same time, for me, I feel like Syrah moves at a slightly more glacial pace than a lot of other varieties that we work with. And, they seem to be aging really well.
Stylistically, what influences do you think you draw on for Syrah? More Californian or more European, or?
So for me, I never want to forget the fact that we're making wine in California. I mean, that's a very important thing. But at the same time, I think when you have the greatest examples of the Northern Rhone, and for me, I look at, like so many others, I look at Gonon, I look at Graillot, I look at, obviously Chab, I look at, Jamais. You look at those really well-balanced producers that produce wines that have an enormous amount of perfume and poise and elegance in them, on top of having the natural power of Syrah. I mean, look at Allemande and Klopp and all of those folks. But I do think that a lot of times, if you were to actually look at the best of those Northern Rhone examples and you were to put them in a flight, and let's say you had the gamut of Burgundy on one side and California Syrah on the other, a lot of times I feel like they're way closer on the gamut to Burgundy than they are to the natural weight we can get in California. Like for me, it's almost too easy to make wines of amazing color and extraction and density and power in California. To me, the trick is trying to figure out how we balance that with getting that perfume and that ebullience and that dance and that lift that I think that you see in those Syrahs that excite me the most from the Northern Rhone. And so it's kind of finding that the balancing act between the two of them. Whereas, we're always going to have that weight making wine here in California. But it is finding a way that we can also have enough sort of, liftedness and lightness in the wines to make them pleasurable at the same time. So, it's finding, for me, it's finding the balance between those two, and whole cluster, cold sites and, and a little bit of Viognier sometimes are probably our three best friends when it comes to that.
Yeah, and most people probably are thinking about your top Syrahs, but I often like your, I guess now it's called coast to coast, but the entry level bottling, which is, one of the questions that often gets asked is like, how do I get into wine, or what should I do? And when I was learning about wine, people always said, buy the least expensive wine from the best estates.
Totally.
So that's one way to sort of explore without necessarily, spending a huge amount of money. Not that your wines are that expensive relative to the world of wine, but that's a one way that a younger person or somebody who wants to say, I want to taste a Bedrock wine, or I want to taste a wine from another producer, you can always go for one of the lesser expensive wines. It's a great way to get started.
Well, not California. Sorry, we can
go
go into California Syrah forever, but it's. I was just going to say that. I mean, we don't buy any fruit for that basic bottling. It's just all declassified fruit from our vineyard designates. So, it's not a high margin bottling for us, but in some ways, it's really important to me because I want people to have access to Syrah that really tastes like Syrah. That's not $1 million from California. So that's the point behind that one.
All right. So before we go to this wine, which is your wedding wine, the last, which you're very gracious to share, I'm just curious: are there any, because these areas like the back of your hand? You grew up there. You worked with your dad when you were a kid. Now you're making your own wines. Are there any vineyard sites that you think, I'd love to make a wine from there?
There's several, but Tegan Pasalaco would kill me in my sleep. So there's that. He has actually promised to shiv me about one of them. But so there's
everybody dying.
I think there's some Turley sites that are pretty good. But honestly, there's a couple sites that I think don't get their due in some ways that I think are really, really exciting. One of them is a ranch called Brandlin Ranch, which is up on Mount Veeder. It's historically been made by Peter Frannis, who makes really good wines from it. I just think he kind of falls under the radar, but it's really the only old vine Zinfandel left on the Napa Mount Veeder side. And it's just like this classic mountain fruit. Like, I think that's just an incredible site. Rosenblum used to make it back in the day, and they had the worst name. I think it was called Pickleberry Canyon. And which is just not something that you just go, I'm just gonna chug that. And so, so Brandlin Ranch is one of them. I mean, Hain is on everybody's list. I mean, that vineyard, for both Zinfandel and Petit Syrah, is pretty unbelievable.
That's in St. Helena.
That's in St. Helena. And then, I mean, I think the other one, and it's, we've never made any wines from Paso Robles. I do think that Uberoth Vineyard down there on Willowside, down next to Saxum, out there in West Side Paso, makes some wines that are just, just the fact that it's on limestone, it's out there, it's own rooted, it's 130 years old. I mean, that makes some extraordinarily distinct wines. So, those are definitely on the list. But, all in all, I consider myself pretty darn fortunate with the vineyards that we get to work with. In part due to the last recession, we got offered some fruit that I don't think normal young wineries would have ever been offered, including Pagani Ranch. So I remember at one point in 2012, after we'd been in business for 5 years, my dad just came into the winery and started tasting through tanks with me. And he's like, how? He's like, it took me 25 years to get, a cadre, a quiver of vineyards together that were like this. So, I feel very, very fortunate on that front.
Wow, that's a great story. So let's talk about this wine. I showed you guys a label a second ago, but this is your wedding cuvee.
Yes.
Do you think you might make this wine more kind of going forward? I mean, so tell us what this is exactly.
Yeah. So I think my wife's actually listening in the other room right now. So I think she's watching. So this is the wine that Kate and I put together for our wedding last June. So it's, I've always wanted to put together sort of a quote unquote super cuvee of the Sonoma Valley vineyards that we get to work with. And for us, it was also really meaningful because every single person who grew the grapes for this wine, Dino and Carrie Amentiti, Will and Lizanne Buckland, and then, Bedrock, were all at the wedding celebrating with us. So, that really meant an enormous amount. And in many ways, for me in my head, combining that power and that that strength of Pagani with some of that perfume of Old Hill combined with sort of the backbone and the structure of Bedrock has always made intuitive sense to me. So it's been really fun to make it. So, obviously I can't get married every year, but I'm very excited. Kate's 4 months pregnant. So, maybe we'll
Wow.
have another opportunity to make a cuvee of some type this year, and hopefully one that'll last, a good long time. So,
Yeah. So you have 2 barrels of each of those, that, if I remember correctly, right? 2 barrels of
yeah,
each.
exactly. So 2 barrels each of Old Hill, Pagani, and then at Bedrock, where we have several different blocks that we vinify separately, it's 2 barrels of blocks 39 and 42, which are my 2 favorite blocks on the whole ranch, which are kind of the backbone of Bedrock Heritage every year. And so those are the ones that sort of fit together the best. So yeah, and it was fun. I don't think you can say that it's a strong marriage as a winemaker until you've blended a wine with your future wife to be and agreed on something that's delicious. So
Agreeing is very important.
yes.
Great. So a barrel of wine is 25 cases for folks who don't know. So it's 150 case blend.
Yeah.
And once that's it, right?
144 cases with racking loss. So,
Yeah. And then you probably drank half of them at your wedding.
we did drink some at the wedding. So yeah, it's out there. It's funny. We offered this wine on our last release, and obviously we made such a small amount of it that we couldn't offer as much of it as we'd like to. And I mean, I wish we had made more. It's by far the most in-demand wine we have ever made, which was just really gratifying to sort of see that people were so excited about it. And honestly, you can, we had a relatively small wedding, all things considered. And so it is sort of nice to be able to share something of ourselves. And being a Sonoma Valley boy, I mean, these are the vineyards that I grew up in and were in my backyard. So it also sort of feels like a nice statement of place, particularly because the wedding itself was at Bedrock Vineyard. So it was, it just sort of felt proper thematically and emotionally.
Yeah. And so did you make this wine, when you make a wine like this, do you blend it kind of at the end of élevage, at the end of aging, or did you want to age a kind of a blended wine?
So this one we did later, we did late in élevage. And in fact, so what we did was we actually, because the wedding was in June and we didn't bottle this until August, we actually put together a blend that we drew some cases off of for the wedding, and then we ended up bottling the rest of it a little bit later. So the wine that we actually had at the wedding was just about 7 weeks fresher than this one was, but it's all pretty fresh.
Got it. One of the questions that we have is something you've been involved with in the past, is a historic vineyard society. So where is that now, and what's the?
So it's not gone anywhere. What the Historic Vineyard Society was started by a group of us: Mike Officer at Carlisle, Tegan at Turley, David Gates at Ridge, and then Bob Bialy came on, and a guy named Mike Dildine. And the goal was, at the original point, is like, we were at this moment where old line vineyards are kind of being ripped out right and left, particularly in Russian River Valley, when there's a huge craze for planting Pinot Noir. Mike Officer lost one of his most treasured vineyards out in Pioneer Olivet called Barbieri, which had been planted in 1896. And we realized that there's these old vineyards that, like, we had no idea how many old vineyards were even out there. So we didn't know how much of this resource we were actually losing. So part of the original goal of the organization was to actually start to create a list of all these old vineyards. And so we actually knew what was there. And we've been very active and successful in doing that. If you go to the Historic Vineyard Society website, you'll see all of our registered vineyards, which has taken, a lot of teamwork. I mean, Antonio, as you know, working in Napa, you know that sometimes growers can not necessarily be the most forthcoming with information. So it's
Really?
Yeah, right.
I hadn't noticed.
So, trying to get people to be involved and trust us and know that we're trying to do well by them. And then on top of that, we've put together vineyard tours, where I think the most important thing too is, I don't think you really experience old vine vineyards until you actually walk through them and you see, you walk through an old vineyard and you're like, and you look at an arm and you ago, that's 70 years of pruning positions. Like that's 70 individual decisions made by multiple generations of people that have led to the point that we are at now, which is a pretty incredible thing. And you just don't see in very many anything really, but in particularly in agriculture. And so that part's really incredible. So we do that. And then what we've also started to do as a main fundraising mechanism is we every year we've been putting together a Historic Vineyard Society wine, which basically is a blend of a little bit of wine from a bunch of different wineries, but from an individual vineyard every year. So we've done one from Bedrock, we've done one from Pagani, we're going to do one from Evangelo, which I'm very excited about, and start selling that as a means to raise money. And we've got plans we'd really like to put together like an internship for people from Davis. We do a lot of outreach at UC Davis and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and Fresno State, because obviously without the next generation of people coming up being excited about old vines, being excited about Zinfandel and Carignan and Mataro, there's not a lot of places for these vineyards to go. And, and the reality is old vines are under threat all over California for very, very different reasons, whether it's suburban sprawl and urbanization in Contra Costa, whether it's the necessity for mechanization and lowering costs in Lodi, whether it's, and don't get me wrong, I love you, Napa, but Cabernet Sauvignon in Napa, there's all these different economic threats that are being posed to old vines at every turn. And so, we're trying to do our best to shore up information and love and, and excitement about them.
Yeah, well, vineyards are culture and history, so I think that's a remarkable thing, and obviously a very noble pursuit, I should say. Hopefully not an ordeal, objective, I guess. So last question, you have an incredible collection of wines in the back.
Yes.
Behind you. Can you pick one and tell us something about it?
Yeah, let's see. Every single one of those has a story, but I would say, there's a 1969 Burgundy over there that my dad literally just brought over one night after I had broken up with a long-term girlfriend. And I was like crying into my pillow, and he was like, "Son, let's just drink this bottle of wine together." And, it wasn't the best bottle of Burgundy I've ever had, but it was a really fantastic experience. So let's see. I pointed out earlier the 64 Palaverga. Yeah. That's a wine I actually had at Maialino in New York, and I brought that bottle back. It was so surprising. Bottle of 71 Rayos I had in the south of France with my master of wine mentor, Jean-Michel Valette, which was extraordinary. Next to that, most notably, though, a bottle of Ridge 1992 Evangelo Vineyard. So one of the very first wines made from Evangelo Vineyard with the name on it. And we obviously bought Evangelo in 2017 from Frank, and he opened that bottle of wine from his cellar, and he's now since passed. So that, was a really, really special moment and a huge source of pride for him. And next to that is a bottle of 1985 Ravenswood Old Hill. So, my dad's second vintage making that wine. And it's incredible how you have memories. The 99 Jamais, that goes back to a trip that Chris and my father and I had with Jean-Luc Jamais at the estate. And it was very late. I was the only one that spoke French, so I was translating for like hours. And my French is not that good either. And Jean-Luc was starting to had a little bit of wine, was getting very philosophical. I was cooked. I hadn't eaten in like 7 hours. And Chris, in all of his, because he just couldn't resist, just reaches his glass set and goes, "Could I have a little bit more of that 99? And I was forced to translate for another 30 minutes, and it nearly killed me. So brought that bottle back. There's, and then always Madeira, because there's nothing that makes you feel more amazing and smaller than drinking Madeira that dates back to, the Civil War. So it's, all of those are incredible memories. And even, you'll see there's a Desire Lines Riesling up there too, which is our assistant winemaker, Cody's first wine. And, that's a very special thing as a winemaker when your first sort of person that's worked with you starts to do their own thing. And I think like all winemakers, you and everybody that loves wine, you have these incredible bottles that have enormous embedded meaning in them. So that's just some of them.
This is a great lesson, because people always ask you or me or anybody, what's the best wine you've ever had? But the question should be, what's the best story that you have? because all of those wines, all those bottles, sorry, the wine is a fabric of that night, of the breakup, of your assistant winemaker who you've mentored, of all these countless moments in life that are important. And the wine is like one of those strands, but it's not really about the wine itself. It's about the whole entirety of the moment. And that's what you remember.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's what I think makes wine so utterly unique. I mean, it's this one thing where it's, yes, we can talk about all the, all the nerdery, all the winemaking, all the farming, all that stuff. But really what it does is when it, brings people together at the table, provides comfort, solace, stories, jokes, everything. I mean, that's kind of the whole reason why I think we're in it. And, it's just nice to somehow be reminded of all those things. I mean, and particularly now when I think we're all in this sort of slightly distended situation where everything is, the ground feels a little softer beneath our feet than normal. It's good to be reminded of all those times that, we've really been able to be close to people and, enjoyed each other and enjoyed, the fruits of people's very hard labor. So.
Well, Morgan, thanks so much for your time. You've been so generous and so gracious. I think I could talk to you like all afternoon here, but it's fantastic. Just the knowledge and the generosity, your spirit, your enthusiasm, it comes through in all these wines. And it's just always great to taste with you. It's fun to talk and not have 35 wines, just have a few.
Yeah, exactly. Not having to just go through them. Yeah. I will pare down. Maybe I'll pare down next year. We'll see. The look on your face when I brought out that last case, I was like, oh no, what did I do? So
it's okay. It was good. No, all good. But seriously, thanks for your time. I just want to thank all of our viewers who gave us so many questions. We tried to answer as many as we could, but there were just a ton. But thanks everyone for watching.
And sorry, and just one thing, if people had questions that didn't get answered, feel free to email me at morgan@bedrockwineco.com and I'll do my best to answer your questions for you.
That's amazing. There's only about 980 in the queue, but
Well, what else am I doing?
No. Thanks for watching, Morgan. Thanks for your time, and say hello to your dad.
I will pass it on.
All right. Have a great week.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.